Story Design Books and Amazon.com presents Dancing with the Scars, My Choice by Wyatt Jackson. This audiobook is a companion to the actual book that is now on sale on Amazon.com, and I want to thank all of you who have purchased the book. It is now, at this time of this recording, the #2 book in the world on Amazon for artistic expression and memoirs. It's second right now to Bruce Springsteen's memoir, Born to Run. Now, this audiobook companion has songs from artists who own those rights, and this is a free audio companion. So those musicians and songwriters, this is all good. And these songs complement the story, but more importantly, the story complements the songs. So thank you. All right, so this companion works like this. I'm gonna read a little bit of a chapter, and then I'm gonna give my own take on it in my own words in real time, not scripted, and then I'm gonna go back to the actual text with one of the therapeutic reflections, and that's how I do it. Enjoy Dancing with the Scars, My Choice, the audiobook companion. Prologue. This book is about choices one must make in life. It's not a memoir in the traditional sense, nor is it an attempt to document my life story, as many people have suggested I do. Instead, it's the result of reflecting on my life through a colorful and therapeutic lens, and how I responded to the events that shaped me. During the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, loved ones often suggested, "You have plenty of time now during lockdown to write your book." As much sense as that made due to the amount of time we all had on our hands, deep down, I knew that wasn't the right time to reflect in this way. It was a time for all of us to pause and consider life itself. For me, that pause was about grieving the loss of so many people and getting healthy boundaries straight for myself and my family as we all witnessed the world shift towards a new normal. When the worst of the pandemic had passed, I began jotting down my thoughts for the book. 112 pages into it, I realized I had something meaningful to say. Dancing with the Scars is a journey into the power and blessing of movement. Movement that can heal, transform difficult circumstances, and create opportunities for learning, growing, and recovering. My primary flow in this read is of storyteller in the African tradition known as being a griot, at a time in history when our stories as people of color are being dismissed or downplayed. Dancing with the Scars aims to reclaim and honor the power of telling our stories for the purposes of healing, visioning, and power sharing. My intention is for you, the reader, to put the book down a little bit more inspired in your journey than when you picked it up. Oh, and one more thing. No, I'm not the next Lin-Manuel Miranda or Tyler Perry. I am Wyatt Jackson. Chapter 1. Let's go back to the future. Dr. Rick Antonius Kittles, the now famous genetics researcher who partnered with Dr. Henry Louis Gates to roll out their contribution to the Genome Project, took a sample of my DNA to add to his research while I was on the road performing with a dance troupe in Miami, Ohio. I was asked to take a cotton swab and rub it on the walls of my mouth and put that swab in a plastic tube. As simple as that procedure was, The impact was far more major scale. When I eventually received my results a few weeks later, I was both surprised and excited, like most of his subjects on the award-winning PBS series, Finding Your Roots with Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. 82% Sub-Saharan African, Mende tribe from Sierra Leone. 13% European, Scottish blood from the plantation in Macon, Georgia. And 5% East Asian, Native American ancestry. I began to wonder in my creative imagination, if I could travel 9 generations back from my birth in 1964 and speak to my ancestors in each generation, what would those 512 individuals on both my mother's and father's sides of the family think of the stories I'd share about my generation? So this is when I go off script for a minute and just talk about what really happened with me when I found out about this split, 82% African and, 13% European and 5% East Asian. I knew about the 82 because my mother's side of the family, they are chocolate. I mean, they are straight up like African-American chocolate, right? My father's side of the family are lighter skinned. So I knew somewhat about the European influence. The East Asian thing threw me off because at the time, I didn't know that the Native American blood is East Asian blood. Most of the Native Americans are East Asian. So when I went back in time, so to speak, and looked at all of this history and understood what was going on in Kansas, where my great-great-grandfather was coming out of slavery, and then my great-grandmother and my grandmother, Tecumseh Sappho, where she came from, and then all of these folks, Macon, Georgia, Madison, Georgia, my father's side, when I really started to look at it, I really began to get a better picture of why I do what I do, why I am who I am. And the Back to the Future idea became way more cooler. That happens to be one of my favorite movies, or trilogies as it were, Back to the Future. So this whole idea of going back for me was really about understanding where I am now and where I can go in the future. Now, anybody who knows me knows I love to read about history, old school stuff. And so I see now how my family was involved in the slave trade in Georgia, because I understand what was happening in Georgia in the 1700s and 1800s. When I look at the Harlem Renaissance, my family lived in New Jersey and would go into New York to enjoy the Harlem Renaissance music and dance. Our family was friends with Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway and all those Harlem Renaissance artists. My Aunt Cosette Washington, she's now almost 100 years old as of this recording. She talks about how our family was connected to those people. So now I can see how that history connects to what I'm into now. I'm a Harlem Renaissance junkie. I'm a tap dancer. I'm a rap artist. Of course, rapping is connected to scatting. You just go back in the history and you can see why you're doing what you're doing. And so with that, I want to end this chapter by just saying it's incredible when you start to do your research on your history. It's powerful. And I suggest to anyone, if you can get to a database, you can go to the Schomburg Center in New York, in Harlem. If you're African American, they have a huge ancestry database. You can go to Ancestry.com. No advertisement here. I'm just giving you what I know. And you can start that process. And it will explain a lot. It will explain a lot when you know where your blood comes from. So at the end of every chapter, I give a therapeutic reflection. So here's the therapeutic reflection when I swabbed the inside of my mouth for Dr. Rick Kittle's DNA research. I thought I was participating in a scientific study. I didn't know I was stepping into a sacred conversation with the past. That cotton swab opened a portal, one that connected me not just to geography or percentages on a chart, but to people, to blood that endured chains, the spirits that sang through cotton fields, the dreams whispered across centuries. I found out I was 82% Mende tribe from Sierra Leone. That meant my body carried rhythms and wisdom from a tribe known for strength, dignity, and community. That meant I was born of warriors, of survivors, of storytellers. Chapter 2, Boston Calling. Black Roxbury, Mayor Wyatt, and a white Jesus. I grew up in a community that was full of successful, friendly, and driven Black people. Roxbury, the place where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. hung out as a student. Malcolm Little transformed and became Malcolm X. And many Black doctors, lawyers, scientists, and politicians called home. My family landed in Roxbury on the Hill, as folks called it. Elm Hill Ave and the Grove Hall area is where my father and mother decided to settle after marriage. Excellent choice. Where else in the area would they go? Boston's Black community was a colorful, safe, at the time during the 1950s and 60s, and creative place for people of color to live. Yes, there were poor people sprinkled throughout the community. And that didn't keep people from encouraging, affirming, and embracing each other. Black artists and arts educators were everywhere. There were visual artists like Paul Goodnight, Dana Chandler, Alan Rohan Crite, John Wilson. Then there was Louis Jones, singer Donna Summers, composer Walter Robinson, Billy McCarthy, Patricia Adams, and then theatrical artists like George C. Wolfe, who wasn't from Boston, but spent a lot of time in the city doing stuff with theater. Ntozake Shange. Now, her play, For Colored Girls Who Had Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Was Enough, happened here in Boston as somewhat of a trial to see if it could work on Broadway. So she did a lot of theater in Boston. And then the incomparable Elma Lewis, who had the National Center of Afro-American Artists up on Elm Hill Ave. Ife Franklin. Of course, these were incredible, famous Black artists who happened to live in Roxbury and in Dorchester. Now, let me talk from the hip about this. This Boston that I grew up in at the time had the Irish that were living mostly in Dorchester. You had Jewish and African American by the time I was coming up, coexisting in Roxbury. And Boston was, in many ways, not as segregated as it is now. People really got along. And when King had gotten assassinated, the whole thing changed. The Jewish community moved out to Randolph. The Irish pretty much stayed in Dorchester, but there were a lot who moved out to Braintree and Quincy. And then the African Americans were left in Roxbury with all this beautiful property, and a lot of people purchased the homes that these Jewish neighbors had left behind. So I came up in a Roxbury that was absolutely gorgeous, beautiful houses. And my friends lived in semi-mansions. I even lived in one. And we had a great time in these houses. And slowly the neighborhood changed when crack cocaine came in and so on. But before all that happened, there was some serious racism going on in South Boston when Judge Garrity did a court-ordered desegregation thing to make it possible for kids to be bused to different schools away from the communities where they were from. So kids from Roxbury went to South Boston. Kids from South Boston came into Roxbury. This was 1974. I remember I was in the 4th grade, and my mom, hearing that there were going to be riots all over the city, she kept me away from school on the first day. And man, I remember being in her office and looking out the window over at Boston Tech High School. And when the school bell rang for school to end, I saw a bunch of white kids come out of the school. And then when I looked up the street, I saw kids with billy clubs and golf clubs, and they were coming to beat these kids up and do some damage. And that's exactly what happened. All I remember was white t-shirts, blue jeans, long hair, and blood all over the streets. And that was in 1974. Now, Mayor Wyatt, who was the mayor of Boston at the time, he tried his best to bring the community together. And I remember him doing a lot in Roxbury to ease the tensions that were going on there. Of course, he was over in South Boston. He was all over the city trying to bring communities together. Now, his last name was White, and the city was mostly white, and it was a lot of white folks that were being racist. So I was a little confused as a kid about these white folks that were being racist and angry and trying to fix things, and it wasn't working. My family went to a church called Emmanuel Temple Pentecostal Church, and in the lobby of the church was a painting of a hippie, is what I thought. Long hair, blue eyes, light white skin. And it turns out, I asked someone, who is that? And I'll never forget when the person said, that's Jesus. We're going to live with him forever. And I was like, what? Because I was confused. So-called white people are being racist towards black people. Mayor Wyatt is doing all this stuff and it's not working. And then you're telling me I'm going to live forever with a hippie-looking white guy named Jesus. It just didn't make sense. And then to make things worse, in church, the pastor, Pastor Booker, would talk about the Holy Ghost being in the room. And in my little 8-year-old imagination, I saw Casper the Friendly Ghost floating around the sanctuary. So, man, it was a really weird time. So let me just wrap up this chapter by saying the 70s in Boston was like bondage. And it wasn't until I met Dr. Elaine T. Corey, who was the director of the Boston Youth Theater, is where the biggest change happened in my life. I met her at high school in 1980, and she was the one who introduced me to the imagination and the wonder of the theater arts world. And that's when everything changed. Therapeutic reflection. There is a healing that comes when a person begins to truly name their reality. And this reflection is just that, a courageous reckoning with memory, identity, injustice, and hope. Growing up in Roxbury during the Civil Rights era meant walking in a world alive with both promise and peril. The streets were rich with Black excellence, artists, doctors, dreamers, and warriors for justice. And yet, they were also shadowed by systemic racism, busing violence, and a whitewashed Jesus hanging in the lobby of a Black church. This duality, the brilliance of the Black community and the brutality of racial injustice, formed a kind of fire. Not the kind that only burns, but the kind that forges. My young eyes watched this fire dance through culture and contradiction. I was a child in a sanctuary made sacred by sound, spirit, and survival. A boy who was fed by stories, confused by symbols, and ultimately called to the stage. A place where truth could be spoken and dreams could be reborn. My breakthrough, the day I met Dr. Elaine T. Corey, was not just about theater. It was about a sacred activation. Her presence, her purpose, her artistry lit the fuse for my own self-discovery. With Boston Youth Theater, I found more than performance. I found a mirror and a megaphone. I was no longer just reacting to the city's turbulence. I was reclaiming my place within it.
Boston, you're my home. You're the number one place. Frustrated women, the frustrated have to be in by 12 o'clock. Oh, that's a shame. But I'm a wishing and a hoping.
Chapter 3. Enter New York City, 1980s. Breakdance, George Faison and Spike Lee. New York is just a skip, hop, and a jump away from Boston, Massachusetts. Commuting to the city takes 3.5 hours on the Acela Amtrak train, 4.5 hours by car, and only 1.5 hours by plane, making it an easy destination for an aspiring performing artist. Many times, I'd head to New York just to hang out in Times Square's theater district. The lights, the diversity of people, and the city's vibrant energy felt cleansing to me. I'd stop by the grimy old-school record stores, like the one I used to visit on the corner of 43rd and 7th Ave. This little shop buzzed with energy, and it felt like a time capsule of hip-hop culture. The breakbeat records they sold would soon become the backdrop of hip-hop's emerging sound. Buying records there felt like buying a piece of history. I could feel the culture's power in that little record store. After visiting Times Square, I'd usually head to the Roxy Roller Rink, a popular skating spot that transformed into a nightclub after hours. There, I'd spend the night dancing with the pioneers of hip-hop culture. Dancers from all the boroughs of New York City gathered to share, show off, and bite moves from one another. I was in awe of the shapes and contortions they created with dances like the electric boogie, pop locking, and freestyling. The breakdancers, or b-boys, were always the main attraction, especially with the growing popularity of breakdancing. The Rocksteady crew, one of the original breakdance crews from the South Bronx, was often there. Their leader, Crazy Legs, was a Latinx brother who reminded me of the Puerto Rican friends I grew up with in Boston. He looked approachable yet deeply serious about his craft, as if he knew he was making history. I never thought it was a good idea to introduce myself to him. So I preferred to watch and learn from a distance. After going back and forth between New York and Boston throughout the early 80s, working with the Boston Youth Theater for a few years, and developing my voice as a dancer and rap artist, I was prepared to enter the professional world of the performing arts. First, I had to deal with the loss of my beloved mother, Jean V. Jackson. When I lost my mother to cancer that hot summer day in June of 1987, my life went upside down. Mom was secretly dealing with the cancer, and during those weeks leading up to her death, she began to show signs of her body giving way to the disease. In one instance, I was performing in a play with the Boston Youth Theater in downtown Boston at the Transportation Building, and Mom came to the show, Inner City Energy, and did something that was odd for someone to do in a theater. She started yelling during a scene I was featured in, "Go Wyatt! Go Wyatt!" Embarrassed, I didn't know how to process what was happening. She had never done that before when she would come to see me perform. Why behave like that in a theater? Well, after she passed a few weeks later, it became clear. She knew that was the last performance she would see me do. She wanted to encourage me in the lane I had discovered, theater arts. So, the grieving process for me was tough that summer. I had gotten a few women pregnant. They had abortions and miscarriages. Now, here's the thing. I was not dealing with my grief in a healthy way. And it was really something. So during my grieving, Diane Walker, my surrogate mother now and my mentor in the arts, had been calling me. And she told me about an audition that was happening in New York for a show called Body and Soul that was going to tour Europe for 6 months. Now, the show had called her because she was, in a way, like a middle person for Jimmy Slide, the late tap dancer. And at the time, he didn't want the gig. He said, "No, I'm not doing that." And she thought of me. She called me and said, "I think you would be perfect for this show. They're looking for avant-garde kind of specialty acts, and I think you fit that. So think about it." Well, I thought about it. 2 weeks later, she called back and said, "They called me again, Wyatt. I think you should just go and audition." So I got myself together, went to New York. And on the way there, I was reading the book, Unlimited Power by Anthony Robbins. And while I was on that bus reading that book, I had this vision of the audition. And I saw these people like accepting me and saying, "We want to work with you," or something like that. And then the vision went away. Well, when I got to New York, it just felt odd, that's like my first time being there or something. And I went to the audition space, and when I walked into the area where all these people were sitting and waiting to audition, I just got this feeling like I was supposed to be there. And I saw Chuck Green, the famous tap dancer that I had only seen in videos and read about in books. So I went up to him and introduced myself and told him I was Diane Walker's son. And he lit up as an elderly man and asked me how she was doing. And at the time, I called her from a phone there, and they talked on the phone. And then they called my name, Wyatt Jackson. When I walked in the room for the audition, it looked like exactly what I had envisioned when I was on the bus reading the book Unlimited Power. And George Faison was in there. Andre Heller, the creator of the show from Vienna, Austria, was there. And the late Howard Porter, the assistant director, was there. And a Tony Award-winning Linda Twine, music director, was there. Now, George Faison was also a Tony Award winner, so I was in the middle of royalty in this audition. And George Faison asked me, "What are you going to do, son?" And when I told him all that I was going to do, the room started to slow down. And I did everything I could do. I tap danced, I did some hip hop dance, I rapped, I sang, and Linda Twine accompanied me. And right there, after I did my thing, they started whispering to each other. And then they turned to me and said, "We want to work with you. Where are you going to be in an hour?" And it was similar to what I had envisioned on the bus. I got in the show, and New York changed. Everything changed. I finally started rehearsing in New York with the cast. It was amazing. George Faison was the life of the cast. We had divas in the show: Carol Dennis Dillon, Clint Bowers. All of these choreographers were working with the show. You had the daughter of Duke Ellington, Mercedes Ellington, was the tap dance choreographer. Of course, George Faison was doing the modern and the African and a lot of the show business, like musical theater numbers. And then you had Graciela Danielle, Broadway diva choreographer. She was also doing some of the musical theater numbers along with some jazz and some modern. It was an incredible, incredible production team. Roy Lichtenstein, the visual artist, he contributed his work to the show. Jean-Michel Basquiat, his work was in the show. And then all of these people are now late, the late Keith Haring, his work was in the show as well. So this was an amazing production. Now, for me, the energy of this show was going up, 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 until I got a call from a friend of mine from Boston who told me that a friend of mine who went to New York over the weekend, Lenora, had passed away because she was killed at a party. And I remember New York changing at that moment. It became a very cold and dark place. The next day I went to a newsstand and I picked up a New York Times, and there on the front page was the story of Lenora's passing. And it was traumatic. And part of the reason why it was because I felt like I was blocks away from her during her last days on the planet. So to get my energy back, I dedicated me being cast in the show to her memory. Europe was amazing. We opened at the Deutsches Theater in Munich, Germany, that February of 1988, and the show was a huge hit. But George Faison, many years later, reconnected with me, and I did a lot of work with him. I worked with him and Mavis Staples. We did a show in Vienna, Austria together. Worked with him and Aretha Franklin in New York at Radio City Music Hall. We did a show called Divas Live, and it was with VH1, and performed alongside Stevie Wonder, Kid Rock, Herbie Hancock, Janet Jackson, all these famous people. We all celebrated Aretha, and my role in that show was to dance with her during a remake of the Blues Brothers movie where she sang Think with the late John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, who were playing the Blues Brothers, and I played one of the Blues Brothers. It was a fantastic, fantastic experience. George really took me under his wings and gave me a sense of what it meant to be mentored by a giant in a city like New York. I did many shows with George and was able to even house sit for him and his partner Tad, the late Tad Schnug. When they would go out of town, they asked me to take care of the dog and, make sure the house stayed tight. All right, so I have a funny story. So George and T had entrusted me with the house many times, but this time they were going on a longer trip and they asked if I could house sit for a few days, actually. So I said, sure. And, they made sure that I had food. Now, George is an excellent cook, so he had prepared some wonderful fried chicken wings for me that was in the refrigerator whenever I needed it. I had to take the dog out. I did that and, took care of the house. Now, I had some dirty clothes that I needed to get washed, and he had a laundry in his house. So I thought I would use this European laundry machine, and I put my clothes in it, and I could not understand the language. I don't know if it was French or Italian, but the bottom line was this. I put my clothes in, I pressed what I thought was go, and the trunk filled up with water, and then nothing. Now, at the time, George was known for, speaking his mind and being confrontational, like, excuse me, but the blah, like, oh no, I broke the man's laundry machine. And I knew I was done. When he got back, I was going to hear it, and it was not going to go well. So I waited. Finally, they came home. The dog met them at the door. Then I had to break the news to George. So when I told him I was trying to wash my clothes in your machine and it just stopped, he gave me this look like he was about to read me, right? And then he walked over to the machine, hit one button, and it worked. He said, look, man, you don't know how to use a European laundry machine, okay? And then he just looked at me and said, next time, just call me. The bottom line was that George is a wonderful man, and I met many people under his guidance. Met Maya Angelou at his house, and I experienced that smile that she gives to people when she says hello. I spent time having chicken wings with the late Roberta Flack, and we enjoyed laughing and talking about life and the industry. And what I know about George is that his heart is in the right place when it comes to giving the younger generation what they need. And I'll never forget that man for embracing me as an artist, as a brother, as a mentee, and entrusting me. I mean, there's so many things I could say about George Faison. He is a living legend. Therapeutic reflection. New York City didn't just change me, it activated me. I came to New York City from Boston with the hunger of an artist and the ache of a son who had just lost his mother. What I didn't expect was that the city would become more than a backdrop for my creativity. It became a mirror, a stage, a cathedral, and eventually a sanctuary of transformation. I went there to chase applause. I ended up encountering purpose. Those early trips, digging through crates in grimy record stores, dancing at the Roxy, marveling at the flow of breakdancers and the electricity of Times Square, those were my rites of passage. I was learning a rhythm that wasn't just hip-hop. It was ancestral, revolutionary, spiritual. At the time, I didn't have the language for what I was experiencing, but now I know. New York was turning me into a prophet in sneakers and stage lights, a griot in motion. Chapter 4. Michael Douglas and Atlantic Records, Here and Now. Getting signed with a demo cassette. In the early 1990s, I ventured to create a music recording group called Here and Now. This rhythm and blues hip-hop duo, made up of myself and singer Derek Patterson, was designed like the two-man vaudeville groups of the Harlem Renaissance in the early hip-hop era. Many two-man groups from New York City neighborhoods became big names in the music industry. Run DMC, Kid and Play, Nice and Smooth, Salt and Pepper, and others inspired me to create a duo that would hold the traditions of the old-school vaudeville vibe. Of all the groups from the East Coast who inspired me, none would get me more locked in to the art of hip-hop other than Chuck and Eve from Boston. Chuck, Big Chuck Stan, and Antonio Twice Thou Ennis are, in my estimation, two of the most incredible rappers I've ever heard in my life. I vividly remember a performance they gave in the mid-'80s at the Joseph Lee School on Talbot Ave. This night was wild, full of raw energy. Local acts performed. The funk effects hit the stage, and the atmosphere was electric. But everything shifted when the announcer called out that Chuck and E was about to perform. The crowd surged towards the stage in anticipation. When the curtain opened, there they were, Chuck and Antonio, in pinstripe train conductor suits. A third guy whose name I can't recall manned the drum machine. The beat dropped. Boom, boom, bap, ba-boom, bap. What followed was the most powerful expression of hip-hop culture I've ever witnessed. It wasn't just a performance. It was theater. It was storytelling. It was revolutionary. When I would come to find out later that Chuck and I were related through marriage and had even attended the same middle school at the same time, I had no idea we shared that connection. Seeing him perform alongside Antonio Ennis, who later made waves in hip-hop through the Boston-based group The Almighty RSO, built a solo career, and became a successful entrepreneur in fashion with the Antonio Saldi brand, affirmed something deep in me. I'll stop right there and talk a little bit about this era. I was a hip-hop junkie. Once again, going to New York in the 80s. By the time the 90s came along and I had seen the connection between vaudeville artists and hip-hop artists, I really believed that I had everything it took to create a group and to get signed and tour the world. And that's exactly what happened. I started demoing ideas with Derek Patterson when he and a friend of mine named Sean Johnson came to Europe when I was doing that play Body and Soul in the 80s, late 80s. And we performed actually the after party for the Michael Jackson Bad Tour. Can't make this up. Marcel Avram, who was the promoter for Body and Soul, the show that I was in, and the Michael Jackson Bad concerts, he had gotten wind that I was the hip-hop artist for the show, and we met, we discussed possibly getting a deal in Europe and that he would have me open up for some of these big acts that he was promoting. But when I came back from that tour, I had a vision, once again, of a two-man group, and I created Here and Now. And we started gigging everywhere in Boston. We did every show that we could get our hands on. Talent shows, fashion shows, weddings, you name it. We were doing them all. And a woman by the name of Stacy Earle, who was signed to RCA Records, she came to see us perform at a club downtown and loved what we were doing. And she asked me specifically if I could teach her how to dance for one of her music videos that she was getting ready to do in Los Angeles. And then she said something that I had heard before from other people in the industry, but I didn't pay it any mind. She said, hey, look, if you have a demo tape, give it to me and I'll give it to my people in LA. Now, I just happened to have one and I gave it to her. And man, dreams really do come true. She had given our demo tape to, at the time, Michael Douglas's company. He had a record label on Warner Brother Records called Third Stone Atlantic. So it was a record company that was under the Atlantic Warner Brother imprint, and they were doing big things in Los Angeles with a publishing company, a movie deal for the artists that they signed. We wound up signing a 7-album deal, and we got a publishing deal with Warner Chappell Publishing. It was the biggest thing that was coming out of Boston for R&B and hip hop since New Edition. And we recorded everything in New York and in LA. We released the first CD at the time in cassette, and it was called I Can Deliver. It was climbing the charts. We had a placement in a movie called Losing Isaiah with Halle Berry and Jessica Lange and Samuel Jackson. And we did really well. We toured with BET, we toured with Atlantic record artists, and it was amazing. And then Michael Douglas had a falling out with Warner Brother Records, and we got dropped quick. And that was it. And I learned so much about the music industry. We really learned a lot. And we wound up working with some of the biggest names in the industry, touring alongside hip-hop legends and R&B legends, and BET was fantastic. When it ended, I figured I would start my own thing. Derek wanted to do his own project. And I wound up doing something eventually where I used, of course, TuneCore to publish my music. And it was much harder than I thought because you have to do all the legwork. If you don't have a company backing you, you really have to figure it out yourself. But the most important thing I learned about the music industry is that it's a calling. It's a calling to get crowds going. And we had some really powerful shows in the Midwest and on the East Coast, and radio shows that we did. Here in Boston, we did all kinds of shows with the biggest radio stations, and it was all good. Of course, the business side of it is the other piece, and Michael Douglas really didn't get along with that company, and they broke off from each other because he's a movie guy and they're a record company. So either it's going to work or it's not going to work, and it didn't work. So biggest takeaway from all of that was to embrace the calling and to know that you as a musician, you have a responsibility, I believe, to give positive energy to the communities that love your music. And when you do that, it comes back to you. Therapeutic reflection. The music industry was never just about beats and bars for me. It was a baptism, a calling, a strange and sacred classroom where creativity met commerce and intuition met infrastructure. When Derek Patterson and I formed Here and Now in the early 1990s, we didn't know we were stepping into a world that would test every part of our being, from our voices to our vision, from our bank accounts to our belief in ourselves. But we moved forward because something in our spirit said, go, sing, heal.
From the time we joined hands, I knew deep in my heart we would stay together and never part. But as time moved on, we couldn't swing with our thing, the vibe changed. Our lives got strange. We stepped back from each other for a time. Now we're together again, and I feel fine. Thanking the Almighty for bringing us back together. How clever. May our love endure forever.
Here we go, here I am, tasting love again. Here we go, here I am,
Tasting love again.
here we go, oh baby, here I am, tasting love again. Here I am.
Tasting love.
Chapter 5, Dancing Before the Lord. Dancing in the Spirit for the Black Church. Liturgical dance, as a form of spiritual connection to a higher power, was introduced to me when I first started attending Bethel AME Church in Boston. The notion of dancing before the Lord felt strange and uncommon, given that my background in dance stemmed from the vernacular expression of street culture and theatrical conventions. A woman named Dr. Loretta Baugh shared this idea with me while I lived in her upstairs apartment. Curious about this form of dance, I sought to understand how it related to my faith-based expression. I considered the possibility of dancing at my church when I found the courage to do so, wanting to ensure that I wasn't merely performing out of physical capability. I aimed to learn what this form of dance truly entailed and how to connect it with the story of dance I held within my faith. So, liturgical dance for me really came on the heels of also learning modern dance. Now, remember, I am a hip-hop artist, so modern dance and liturgical dance, which just means spiritual dance, were so foreign to me, but I got into modern dance first. So I was hanging out in Cambridge, and I picked up on the power of modern dance by hanging out at this place called the Dance Complex in Central Square. And I started learning modern dance from some amazing teachers. Now, I had checked it out a little bit when I was working at the Wang Center in Boston when I was a teenager. Alvin Ailey would come to town and I would watch his company do modern dance and ballet. But now I was learning modern dance along with being a hip-hop dancer. So liturgical dance, for me, felt like it was modern, but I wanted to put some sensibilities of street dance in it. So I wound up doing that mixture at my church, Bethel AME Church, Boston. And the pastor of the church, Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond, he himself is a modern dancer. He actually studied modern dance at the Elmer Lewis School of Fine Arts in Boston back in the 70s. So he understood what it meant. He actually turns out to be one of the first men of color in this country to take on Black liturgical dance at the St. Paul Church in Cambridge. So this was a big deal to have this platform. I was in a prior marriage relationship and we danced for the church, and there was a lot that went on with that. A lot of inspiration, a lot of encouragement. Alvin Ailey was coming to town every so often, and I met those dancers, and it turned out that Dwight Rhoden, at the time, one of Alvin Ailey's premier dancers, got wind that I was a musician and a dancer, and he asked me if I would be interested in composing music for one of his ballets that he was creating for Alvin Ailey. And I took on the project. Now, he and his partner, Desmond Richardson, were going to be doing this choreography for the company, and they were going to do a huge premiere of this piece in New York City at City Center. So I knew I had to bring my A game with this music. And I wound up creating a counter bass thing, two bass lines dancing together. I worked with musicians to create this piece, and it wound up getting placed in the show, in the ballet, and it was fantastic. The reviews were amazing in the New York Times, and the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater became a client of mine. And I wound up working with Alvin Ailey's company, not just with the ballet, with the music, but I also became their director of Ailey Camp, which is a summer intensive for young people where you teach them all the different forms of dance within the Alvin Ailey mindset, which is to enrich lives. So that was going on while I was also still ministering in dance at the church. Wound up connecting with the Bryant family. Bishop John Bryant and his wife, the late Reverend Dr. Cecilia Bryant, asked me to do dance ministry with them all over the country. Alabama, Chicago, Illinois, D.C., Baltimore, you name it, Texas. And I wound up doing large-scale ministry with hundreds of people dancing together based on the choreography that I came up with. So liturgical dance has been and continues to be an extremely important expression for me because I get a chance to activate my faith through movement. Therapeutic reflection. There are moments in a life's journey when art ceases to be a performance and instead becomes a prayer, a quiet, embodied offering to the sacred. For me, that moment began at Bethel AME Church in Boston, where the idea of dancing before the Lord cracked open something I didn't yet have the words or courage to name. Coming from the world of street movement and theatrical formality, liturgical dance felt foreign at first, until I realized it was simply calling me back to something ancient, ancestral, and deeply honest. It was not a performance, it was presence. And in that presence, I began to heal. Chapter 6, You Doing the Blue? Black musicals and how I connected to the history of Black Broadway. This chapter title comes from a quote by the late tap dance legend Jimmy Sir Slide Mitchell, spoken when he heard I had been cast in the European tour of Black and Blue, the acclaimed Broadway musical review. The show was returning to its roots at the Théâtre du Châtelet in Paris after a full-circle journey. It premiered there in the 1980s, went on to Broadway, and was now heading back to where it all began. My experiences learning about Black musical theater and its history happened when I got in the show Body and Soul. An even deeper education came from getting cast in Black and Blue, the Tony Award-winning Broadway musical review celebrating the creativity and expression of the Harlem Renaissance. Black and Blue centered on the cultural influence of the Harlem Renaissance during the 1920s and 30s. Its primary focus was on celebrating the music and dance of the era. Now, what I love about this play, Black and Blue, and what I also love about Body and Soul, is that it captures the aesthetic of the people during that time in history in the Harlem Renaissance. Body and Soul is much more broader. It talked about Africa and it made its way up to the antebellum period and then into the Harlem Renaissance. Black and Blue really centered on the quality of the people and what they believed was the most important expression at the time. Musical theater was being developed many, many years before the Harlem Renaissance came to be. But the books that I read about the Harlem Renaissance informed me on the choices that were made by specific artists at a specific time in world history and, of course, in New York's history. Diane Walker had introduced me to a book called Jazz Dance by Marshall and Gene Stearns. Now, this book is what you would consider, and is what people considered, the Bible of tap dancers. And she was very clear with me, Wyatt, when you read this book, you'll have a better, broader understanding of what it means to come into the mentality. She had always talked about the mentality of a tap dancer. And so this book helped me to understand some of that. Now, she also, gave me a huge heads up about the racial issues in the world, period, but also the issues that come up when you claim that you are an entertainer, especially a Black entertainer. And for that, I will never forget all of what she taught me about those racial issues and how you have to counter the narratives that other people put on you by knowing who you are. So I say a heartfelt thank you to Diane Walker because I understand what she was really trying to do with me. She was preparing me not just for life as a performing artist, who is, of course, a man of color, but for life itself, giving me a heads up about how people treat people and how you have to know who you are. I had a song on one of my previous albums called I Am That I Am, and she used to always say to me, Wyatt, it's in one of your songs. Remember, I am that I am. So I say that with a real sense of love for her opening the door for me, not just with Body and Soul, but with Black and Blue. This show really embraced the love of the people of Harlem and of the Harlem Renaissance. It turns out that term, Harlem Renaissance, happened way after the movement that happened in the 1920s and 30s. It was actually called the New Negro Renaissance. And a man by the name of Alain Locke, an educator from Howard University back in the day, and he was a very profound thinker, he wrote a book called The New Negro. And that book was embraced by Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and many others, and that became, in a lot of ways, the blueprint for what is now called the Harlem Renaissance. Fantastic show. We performed it in Berlin, Germany, and then we eventually went back to the Châtelet Theater in Paris, and it was fantastic. I felt honored to be a part of this historical production. I'll never forget it. Therapeutic reflection. My real education in Black musical theater didn't come from a script. It came from being inside the story. When I joined Body and Soul and later Black and Blue, I entered a sacred lineage that began in the hush arbors of the South, journeyed through the cakewalk contest of the antebellum plantations, and exploded in the Harlem Renaissance like a trumpet blast of freedom. As I stood in character on Broadway stages, tap shoes echoing rhythms that once brought enslaved men a fleeting moment of humanity, I felt the weight and glory of every step. Diane's mentorship wasn't just about teaching me the steps of Jimmy Slide or the vocabulary of Buddy Briggs. It was about showing me how every shuffle carried memory, every rhythm held resistance. Chapter 7. Can we talk? Dance. Heal. Reverend Liz Walker in the Trauma Healing Community. This chapter discusses my introduction to and immersion in the field of trauma-informed community-based healing. It explores the mindset I developed because of critical thinking in a context that was familiar to me, yet I was previously unaware of the psychological dimensions at play. In 2014, I joined the team that created the trauma-informed Corey Johnson program for post-traumatic healing. This multifaceted program is based in the Social Impact Center at Roxbury Presbyterian Church in the heart of Boston. Roxbury. The executive director of the program at the time was Reverend Elizabeth Walker, an Emmy Award-winning television journalist turned reverend. I've known Reverend Liz for most of my adult life and interestingly met her on a few occasions when I first started performing professionally in the arts scene in Boston. Over the years, if I saw her at an event, she would always take time to address me by name and ask me what I was up to. As a young man coming up in Boston, having a highly successful sister like Liz Walker remember your name and ask you how things was going was a big deal. It got even more interesting when she started attending my home church, Bethel AME Boston, under the leadership of Reverend Doctors Ray and Gloria Hammond. She eventually accepted the call to ministry and began doing missionary work with Reverend Gloria in Sudan, Africa, during the third wave of civil war in that country. As a journalist, she turned the mission work into a series of segments about the war in the Sudan and the slavery that happened there. I'll pause and talk about how this all came together with the Can We Talk Network. Reverend Liz went on to become the interim pastor of the Roxbury Presbyterian Church when a friend of our pastor, Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond, his name is Reverend Herman Hamilton, was moving to Los Angeles. And he asked Ray Hammond if Reverend Liz would be interested in being the interim pastor. She took on the role and immediately started connecting with the families of this church in the middle of Roxbury. One family, the Johnson Fitzpatrick family, had just lost one of their sons, Corey Johnson, to gun violence. Now, Reverend Liz met the family. They were grieving, and she did all the things that a pastor in this context would do. She prayer service. She had different family members connect with services. They did peace walks. They connected with the city of Boston. They did all kinds of stuff to deal with the murder of Corey Johnson. After all those attempts to bring some kind of understanding and awareness and even healing to the family, they were still down and grieving. So her and a woman by the name of Colleen Sharker, who's a licensed clinician, they came up with an idea to do community gatherings in the basement of the church where they would have a microphone, open mic, and anyone who was hurting could get up on the mic and talk about their story. And they did that for the Corey Johnson family And then they invited other families to do it. And literally, it went from people from the community coming and telling their stories to people from other communities coming and telling their stories. And what Reverend Liz asked me to do was to be the expressive artist that would dance or play the African drum in between the stories at specific times. So what turned out to be an ask of me dancing or drumming here and there became a weekly and monthly thing. And we were there to abide with people who were hurting week after week, month after month, and year after year. Now, the Can We Talk Network, this is what it's called now, it is in 20 locations throughout the country. Massachusetts, Florida, New York, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and other places where people are dealing with trauma. It's a trauma-informed organization. We have clinicians, we have specialists who do a form of outreach and a form of abiding with hurting people that's similar to a therapist without them having to have a degree or have their license in therapy. They're trained in how to come alongside people and listen to them, be there for them. And then we have these meetings bi-weekly where people can come and tell their stories in person, and then bi-weekly on Zoom where you can tell your story. It's a fantastic program that has helped many people heal in community. It is now a national program. It even went international when Reverend Liz and a couple of other people from the program were invited to go into the war-torn spaces overseas and listen to people who've been traumatized by war. So I'm thankful to say that through abiding with others who are hurting and being able to come alongside people and listen to them, we are seeing communities heal. Therapeutic reflection. I didn't set out to be a healer. My path wasn't carved in the marble halls of clinical institutions or charted in textbooks. It began on the streets of Roxbury, inside dance studios and theater rehearsals, pulsing with rhythm, raw honesty, and the ache of survival. It was organic, unfolding the way music rises from the bones, how dance emerges from a place you didn't know was hurting until you moved. The invitation to join the trauma-informed Corey Johnson program for post-traumatic healing wasn't just a job. It was a spiritual assignment. It called me not only to serve the community, but also to sit still with my own pain and begin to work on listening deeper, moving slower, and being present with what I had been taught to ignore. Chapter 8, Finding My True North Love. Falling in love at 50 and marrying Marcia Kim. Life and Dead is a 2001 American documentary directed by Stephanie Black. The film examines the economic and social challenges Jamaica faced due to globalization, focusing on the effects of policies implemented by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It incorporates excerpts from Jamaica Kincaid's essay, A Small Place, to provide a personal perspective on these issues. The documentary received critical acclaim, winning the Audience Award at the 2002 Prague One World Film Festival and earning a special mention at the 2001 Los Angeles IFP West Film Festival. I was introduced to the documentary by one of my Jamaican students at Bard College in the Berkshires. I was mesmerized by the narrative of Jamaica and how it went through the economic hardships the documentary highlights. I must have watched the piece 9 or 10 times since my first viewing. Little did I know the documentary would give me a sense of narrative I would come to eventually know from an intimate and heartfelt perspective in the form of a love relationship with my wife, Marcia Kim Jackson, whom herself is from Jamaica. So keeping it 100, Marcia and I were what we call brothers and sisters in Christ at Bethel AME Church. And when my life went through the changes it went through, I was in a prior marriage, and when that ended, I spent 5 years by myself, minding my business, attending church, doing what I needed to do to heal, being a part of a brotherhood that was very important to me. Marcia was someone who was there. She was present. She was the church school superintendent, and every so often she would ask me to help her with a Bible study with kids, or can you drive the van to take some people to a conference or some kind of an event? And we were just brother and sister. And interestingly, there was some moments where we would talk about something and I started to feel like I was attracted to her. There were moments where I would get the feeling and say, oh no, whatever that is, I don't know what's going on. And I would get back to fellowshipping or whatever. But there was one particular day where we were in the church lobby and I just saw her from a totally different space. And I knew I was attracted to her. And I even said, I'm attracted to you. And she blushed. And, she later on went to tell me that she thought I was a little weird as an artist, right? But we started hanging out. And we went to dinner one night. And she brought along a mutual friend of ours. And we had a lot in common. And before I knew it, my time with her, we started having more time together. The frequency of our dates picked up. And friends of mine would say, what are you getting into later? And I would say, I'm hanging out with Marcia after church, or I'm going to see a movie with Marcia. Her friends started to notice that she was talking about me more. We started coming together often, and then we became an item in our church community. What became clear to me was that she represented all of the positive ideas I had about starting over in an honest, healthy love relationship. Now, our sons, Brandon and Matthew Kim, are who I call my sons in love. And I've known them ever since they were 12 and 10 years old, because they would come to church with their mother, Marcia, and they knew me as Brother Wyatt. Now, both of them are artists. Brandon is a podcaster and an amazing actor, and Matthew is a poet and a rap artist. And so over the years, we've been able to talk about the arts. We've been able to hang out with respect to what we like about hip hop and what we like about the poetry scene and so on. So when they found out that I was dating their mother, it wasn't like, who's this dude? It was Brother Wyatt. They knew me. And we were able to hang out and really bond. So this is an important chapter to me because in this memoir, you talk about feelings and you talk about your experience. And I feel good about Marcia. The thing about Marcia and me is pretty clear. I see something positive in her. And she sees something positive in me. And that's the focus. There's a deep, deep, deep sense of gratitude that we have for each other. Something I've never experienced. And it was interesting because when we went on a big date with a bunch of friends, we went to a place called the Havana Club in Cambridge. And the Havana Club has bachata, salsa, and merengue lessons that they teach for the first hour of the club opening. And then for the rest of the time, you dance. And you just do your thing to salsa and merengue and bachata music. So there we were learning how to dance salsa. And every so often we would step on each other's toes and laugh, or we would get into a flow. Now she would have to trust me as leading her, and I would have to trust her as someone I could learn a new dance from, seeing that I'm a dancer, right? The ego was in there, like I know how to do this, but no, I didn't really know how to do salsa. So we learned a new dance together, and that was such a great metaphor for our relationship. Every so often, we would step on each other's toes and laugh and keep dancing. Now, while we were dating, I would sing the Stevie Wonder song, You and I. And that classic song has a line that I would love to sing to Marcia. 'Cause in my mind, we can conquer the world in love. You and I, you and I, you and I. Now, I'm not a singer like, someone that you would pay to go hear sing. Trust me, I'm not. But when I sing that song to Marcia, I feel like I'm the best singer in the world. And when we got married, we went to our friends over at the Berklee College of Music and asked if they could find someone to sing that song and play it on the piano for the actual ceremony. And that's exactly what this young man did. And it reminded us of those moments when I sang it to her with no one else around. And in an interesting way, that's what happened when this young man sang it in front of our friends and family. No one else existed in that moment. It was just Marcia and me. And of course, God. Therapeutic reflection. Some stories arrive as documentaries and others as divine encounters. Life and debt first opened my eyes to the layered injustices facing Jamaica through the lens of economics, colonial residue, and globalization. And it also opened my eyes in a way I couldn't have even foreseen. That film, introduced to me by a Jamaican student at Bard, seeded a deeper understanding of a land I would later come to love, not just intellectually, but intimately. Through the woman God had aligned for my life, Marcia Kim.
In love, you and I, you and I, you and I.
Chapter 9, Story Design, Becoming a New Griot, Learning the Power of Storytelling. In the fall of 2017, I attended the story seminar for screenwriting taught by the most celebrated living authority on the subject, Robert McKee. After reading his New York Times best-selling book of the same title 10 years prior, I was ready to participate in the 33-hour seminar. The course covered what one person in the seminar's promotional material claimed to be a bachelor's degree worth of information regarding the art of writing screenplays. After leaving the 3-day seminar, I told people the teachings were more akin to a master's degree worth of information. The seminar encompassed everything from the fundamentals of storytelling from an ancient African perspective, using spoken word and imagination, to writing a compelling 250-page treatment and eventually transforming that treatment into a compelling 120-page screenplay. Now, here's the thing. Now, Robert McKee is an OG in Hollywood. He's been around for a long time, and he has helped like 50 individuals get Oscars for screenplays as he's helped them write. He's a legend. And here's the thing about his work. His work does go along with the conventions that other people use in Hollywood on how to write screenplays. One author in particular is a guy by the name of Sid Fields. He wrote a book about screenplay writing. The whole thing of the beginning of a movie or a screenplay is what you call the setup. Then the middle, about 60 pages into it, is where the confrontation starts usually. And then the end of the screenplay is called the resolution. Now, that's a standard way to write a movie. And what Robert McKee does is he gives you the sense that there's more to the character development than just saying it's a setup and this is what happens in the beginning. What he does is he breaks down that understanding of the setup, confrontation, resolution by saying some very different things about the beginning being exposition. That it's an inciting incident that the protagonist goes through and how the rest of the story is about how they want to get things back to what it was before the confrontations and the craziness or whatever the drama is or whatever the adventure is. So his work went deeper into the character analysis and the way that this character and these characters interact not just with each other, but with the context that they're in. So I learned so much from Robert McKee that one of my original screenplays that I submitted to get greenlit in New York and in LA, I had to revisit it because it had gotten a red light because I had used the Sid Field more Eurocentric beginning, middle, end way of writing a screenplay as opposed to the Robert McKee model, which is more circular, which is more like what the African griots do. The African griot will give you a circular story with many different nuances that the protagonists and the antagonists go through. So this changed my whole view of being a storyteller in the performing and media arts. I went through that seminar with Robert McKee and came out a very different storyteller. Hip-hop changed for me. Hip-hop dance changed for me. Working with New York Broadway people changed for me. I looked at all of it through the lens of story based on Robert McKee's work. And then when I started researching African griots, storytellers from ancient Africa, then I saw an even deeper connection to telling stories in a way that have a theme, a moral. The folklore that I learned from Africa was all about teaching young audiences a principle to live by or a lesson that they need to learn. And to me, that's the highest form of storytelling. And so that's what Robert McKee gave me in that seminar. And that translated into the hit musical review that I am now, as of this recording, experiencing across the country. We Move in Color. Here's the therapeutic reflection. There's a sacred rhythm to story, one that begins not with the first word on a page, but with the heart behind the voice that speaks it. In tracing my journey through screenwriting, from the childhood imaginings sparked by my father's questions about what happens to the story after the story, to the pages of screenplay by Sid Field and the immersive teachings of Robert McKee, I discovered that story design is not merely craft. It is healing. It is identity. It is a calling. Chapter 10, We Move in Color. The Power of Colorful Brotherhood in the Arts. At the time of this writing and recording, the hit musical review We Move in Color, See and Feel the Journey is a national tour that premiered in Boston at the historic Strand Theater in October of 2022. Since that time, the show has been performed at the Kennedy Center in D.C. twice and at the magical island of Martha's Vineyard of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This review was conceived in part during the crisis of COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd. The other side of the creative process came from an organic space of friendship with my brothers and business partners, Robbie Thomas and Gen Rubin. In the summer of 2005, I was faced with the difficult reality of having to live in Boston as a single man after some 15 years of being in a marriage. My new life gave me lots of free time to reflect and connect with people I would have normally not had the convenience of time to do so. During my get out and walk the town days, I ventured to the bank where I had been doing business on behalf of the rap activist group I was in for peace. Then bank manager Robbie Thomas was there, and I figured he would be someone I could talk to about my new set of circumstances. Up to that moment, when I would see him, Robbie and I would talk about the entertainment industry in the old school days when my rap R&B group Here and Now was the happening thing. This visit, however, would be the start of a new conversation. One that had to do with loss, starting over, and the disappointment of working with people who were selfish. Now, Robbie was one of those brothers who would see me in the bank and say, "What's up, Mr. Jackson? How can I help you? What's going on today?" And usually I would come into the bank with a check that I needed to get, processed, and I would grab some money from. And this particular day, I came in looking down, and he just knew something was wrong. And he asked me straight up, what's going on, bro? And I told him my set of circumstances with tears in my eyes. And he had told me, "Look, man, I've been there before. I know what this is about. Let's meet up after I get off work." And he said, dinner on me. And it was perfect because I was on this tight budget, and a free meal, or, just some time and money, not spending any money, was good, right? So I was able to hang out with them, and we went to a Thai restaurant in Copley Square, and told him what was up. And while I'm talking about that, he shared some insights about his, marriage that didn't go that well and how that ended for him. So I felt like he was being transparent in my moment of needing someone to be transparent. There was a lot of empathy in the space at the time. And then we just started talking about the arts. And he mentioned that he was into poetry and that he had published a book and that he had a bunch of poems that he had yet to publish. And I actually witnessed Robbie going through a cathartic moment himself when the conversation started with me talking about loss. And he lit up. It was like an amazing time of sharing about the arts. Little did I know that that was really the beginning of We Move in Color, because what happened way after that, he met recording artist Anita Faye from the West Coast, and they got married and he moved to Las Vegas with her. I met Marcia, of course, in church, as I explained earlier, and we got married, and then the four of us decided to hang out in Las Vegas at their house, and they invited us to see the Michael Jackson Circus Soleil show called One. And the show was so powerful that when it was over, Robbie and I looked at each other and said, we need to do something. Now, Robbie, with his poetry and his business background, and me with large-scale tours and, of course, the music industry, it was a powerful coming together. It was like Warren Buffett and Jay-Z partnering up, becoming friends. I mean, that's how powerful it was. Well, we didn't stop there. My cousin through my father's side of the family, a man by the name of Benny Andrews, the late Benny Andrews, was one of the first African-American visual artists to get his work featured or exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So I talked to my family about possibly having his artwork in a show that I was working on with Robbie. We didn't know what the title was at the time, but I just put it out there. And they said, well, let's see. Well, I called the famous Paul Goodnight, visual artist from Boston, about having his artwork in the show. And he said, wait a minute, Benny Andrews was my mentor. And so he said, count me in. Well, at that time, I started imagining a show called We Move in Color. And I said to Robbie, I think it needs to be called We Move in Color. And he just thought, oh, that's a good working title. Let's keep going. Then I talked to Lou Jones, the famous photographer who's photographed all kinds of stuff all over the world. I asked him if he would lend his photos to the show to be immersively projected on, a 40 by 40 screen along with Paul's artwork. And he said yes. So it turned out that my relative, Benny Andrews, his artwork, it was a bunch of legal stuff that we had to deal with, and we couldn't get his artwork. But Paul and Lou contributed their work. Then we didn't stop there. I called Gen Rubin, who did like 80% of the songs on the Here and Now CD. And I asked him, after him winning Grammy Awards and being the governor of the Grammy board on the West Coast, if he would contribute music to the show. And he absolutely said yes, but he wanted to talk a little bit about the optics of him being the composer, seeing that he was Japanese and Jewish, and he felt that he had so much respect for the African-American story and African-American musicians. He wanted to make sure that we were clear about what this meant to him to be considered. And so I listened to him, and after listening to him, and then I talked about what the show was really about, the universality of Africa and how African American art and expression is a universal a thing, we agreed that he should be the composer, and he agreed to do it, to create that world of We Move in Color. Eventually, the show premiered in 2022 at the Strand Theater in Boston, and we had a 5-minute standing ovation. Pierre Panek from the Smithsonian Museum of African Art and the Kennedy Center from DC, she was in the audience because we had connected with her on Martha's Vineyard, and she asked if she could come and be a voice for young audiences to talk about the importance of African art and African expression. She said after the show, I am going to make sure that this show goes to the Kennedy Center. And indeed she did. We wound up doing 2 different performances at the Kennedy Center in DC. One year and one the next year. Standing ovations, people asking us when we were going to come back. The show is now a national production with artists from New York City, Philadelphia, Las Vegas, Nevada, Washington, D.C., Boston, and other parts of the country, Florida. We come together in New York to rehearse, come together in Boston to rehearse, and then we perform the show here in Boston. We've done the IMAX theaters. We've done the Kennedy Center, as mentioned, and we are now looking at a national tour. So I'm thankful to say that We Move in Color is a successful musical review using the conventions of musical theater, visual immersive art, and the power of Black music. Therapeutic reflection. At its core, this journey is not only about the making of a powerful musical review. It is a layered artistry of healing, brotherhood, artistry, loss, and vision. The creation and rise of We Move in Color from Boston Strand Theater to the Kennedy Center symbolizes much more than professional success. It is a sacred chronicle of transformation through shared humanity and creative resilience.
We move in color, in lockstep with our brother. Radiate love and respect for the mother. Dance, we swing and sway. Float like a butterfly, cash is clay. Praise, uplift, forgiving gift. Look like a loss, going to the cross. But you can't stop the beat or mute that melody that sounds so sweet.
Epilogue. In 2023, after a serious health scare, radio personality, activist, and educator Jose Masol pulled me aside and said something that struck my core. Brother Wyatt, write your memoir. You never know when life will change, and you won't have the chance to tell your story. That conversation woke me up. I returned to the manuscript I had begun years earlier and committed to finishing it. As I approached the final stages of editing, I asked Reverend Liz Walker to read the text and offer an endorsement. She responded with thoughtful, supportive feedback and one critical piece of advice. You must slow down and go deeper with your story, not longer. What you have just read is the result of Jose's urging and Reverend Liz's wisdom, and I am deeply grateful to them both. I mentioned earlier that Malcolm Gladwell once warned in a masterclass, be crystal clear about why you're writing your autobiography. Jose helped me clarify my why. Reverend Liz helped shape how it reads, with more depth and intentionality. My hope is that this story, at times linear, at times not, serves someone somewhere. Each page, to me, feels like a scene in a documentary. I can still hear the music that carried me through as I wrote. And even now, rereading it, I sometimes ask myself, did I really write this? When I asked Reverend Liz to write the introduction, I admitted, I don't feel like I wrote this. She understood. Her own best-selling book, No One Left Alone, released the same year, 2025, emerged from a similar place of revelation. So why did I write about dancing through trauma and my choice to do so? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, except to say, because I can. The truth is, Marcia was the one who really encouraged me to write this book. Without her, this would have been just a thought. I love you for that, sweetheart. Reaching this moment of reflection in life feels surreal at times. It's not imposter syndrome. I've worked through that. It's more the awareness that things could have gone a very different way. But I choose to press on, as the great George Faison once encouraged me, and to get on with it. That phrase still rings in my subconscious. My wife, Marcia Kim Jackson, my true north love, has been my steady compass. She is my partner in love, faith, and ministry, alongside my dear friends, Robbie Thomas and Gen Rubin. She reminds me that we must keep moving. Through heartbreak, through political turmoil, and through the chaos of this new world disorder. Dancing with Marcia through this moment in history is like moving to a rhythm that speeds up, slows down, and changes without warning. Robbie and Gen dance too, with deep understanding of their respective landscapes, Las Vegas and Seattle. Together, we move with purpose. I'll never forget the words of my father, the late Frank Jackson, said to me at our kitchen table the day I left for my first European tour with Body and Soul. Lay back and learn something. That was 37 years ago. I took his advice then, and I'm taking it now. I'm leaning in, listening, learning, and what I believe is the most profound moment in modern history. And if what I learn can be passed on to future generations, my lineage, then the journey has been worth it. As we say in the faith-based community I belong to, the best is yet to come. Connect with me via my website and social media, wjstorydesign.com, at wjstorydesign.